I want to start by talking about basically doing your camera setup. So I'll throw in a few just basic columns, I guess, and we'll go from there. So set this up. I'll make a copy, so I'll go Control D, slide a copy over. So depending on the spaces that you're working with, you're going to need a fairly decent camera setup. And I'm just going to duplicate special here. X, Y, so Z, 30 units on Z, make an instance. Whoa, that's special. Alright, so I'll try that again. Duplicate, edit, duplicate special. I'll do minus, let's say minus 20. Instance everything. Oh, I see. I think, yeah, there's a rotation happening, so I'm going to have to set the rotation to 0. Try that one more time. So I'll make 5 copies of each. Duplicate special. There we go. So the rotation's out. Yeah, it's one problem is if you go into those settings, you will have to check to make sure that they're kind of clean compared to the last time you used this. Now, we talked about this before. If you wanted to create, let's say, your interior space, one thing you could try to do is just simply, create a box, scale it up to the appropriate size. So I'm going to just make this thing a little fatter here and slide it over. And we'll scale that a bit wider. Oops. Slide it down just so it covers everything. And then what I'm going to do is go to, let's go to modeling here and go to mesh display. I'm going to reverse the normals on that. So that way if you're looking inside this thing, right, we can kind of see the lighting and shading from the inside point of view. Now the other thing you can do, some people will do this where they basically delete faces or hide the faces. So I'm just going to, in this case, delete the faces. Because chances are your camera's not necessarily going to need to see those. So let me just go to object mode for now. So when you're setting up your camera, so some people have experienced this too. If you're working in a real world scale and your objects are very large, I didn't really check the scale of my scene, which again, I'm kind of violating my own rules here, but sometimes, I don't know if you guys ever notice this, if you get really, really close, and this case is not quite happening, but if you get really far away, sometimes things will kind of disappear. Has anybody had this issue before? Where it looks like the object's kind of getting chopped away at? So in 3D, what we basically have is this thing called clipping planes, or usually it's viewport clipping or camera clipping. So what that's kind of designed to do is prevent the 3D camera from seeing too much of the scene and possibly crashing it. It's an old system that still has some value today for usually for adding fog and stuff like that after you do a render. So if you need to see, so in this case, by default, your perspective view is actually a camera view. So I'm going to switch to the outliner slash perspective viewport. I'm going to highlight the perspective view camera. And if you go to pers shape, which is basically the camera view, granted, one thing I recommend you ideally try not to do with a perspective camera is change the focal length. It's set at 35 millimeters, which isn't bad, but the human sort of vision typically is in the range, I think, of about 45, 50 millimeters. But again, by default, I wouldn't necessarily change the focal length of your perspective viewport camera. So the one thing you can do is go to, let's see, display options. Oh, sorry, it's right here at the top. The near and the far clipping, okay? So if the near clipping were set to 50, for example, keep in mind this is my perspective view, right? As soon as I get to within that range, you see how it cuts off the mesh? So what that means is as soon as things are at 49 centimeters or less distance from the plane of the perspective camera view, it cuts off. So anytime you see that kind of clipping or cutting of your viewport, oftentimes, you know, you basically need to set your near clipping plane to like 0 or point, if I can. If you set it to 0, it's just going to go to 0.001, which again might create some other weird glitchiness. If you zoom out, you can see things start to go black. So you might want to keep it just a touch higher than 0.001. And the far clipping plane, so again, if you're dealing with real world scale scene, you know, let's say, so somebody wants to build like Central Station in New York or Grand Central Station, that area is going to be a massive area. So the thing is, the far clipping plane of 10,000 centimeters may not be enough to show your whole scene. It'll start cutting off once it's above or further away than that distance, right? So if I set this thing to like 500, a very low number, you see how that disappears? As soon as I get out of range of 500, further away than 500 centimeters, it cuts off. So anytime you see that, you basically need to go into your camera view and crank up the near and or the far clipping plane. So in this case, you know, just to be safe, you can go 100,000 centimeters. So even when you're zoomed out fairly far, you should be able to see it. So that's camera basics. Now, the other thing is creating a camera. There's a couple of ways to do it. I've got my preferred method, which I realize is not exactly industry standard, but a lot of people like to create a camera with an aim. So when you're creating the actual camera to set up for your main view, you can go to either camera or camera with aim. There's one key difference, which is basically that there's an aim. Let's slide this thing over, actually. Yeah, there's an aim locator, sort of a target for the camera. So when you create that camera, it has this little kind of target thing here, right? So that allows you to fix the camera to a particular point of interest. And then once you move the camera, its sort of axis is always fixed, pointing towards that, that locator. Now, something else I like to do when I'm moving around using the move tool, I generally like to set this to the object for a camera. Why? Because then it becomes very easy to slide in and zoom in or zoom out. You see the Z-axis follows kind of the dead center of the camera. The sorry, the move tool over here, I'll set its orientation. So you just have to double click the move tool. It'll open up the settings. By default, it's in world. So what that basically means is the XYZ axis is always pointing, aligning to the sort of north, south pole, east, west, forwards, backwards orientation. As soon as you switch to object, okay, so object, what happens is that axis, the sort of gizmo tool is following the orientation of the object. This is my preferred method of moving a camera around. Same thing if I do rotation. I generally like to set, you see the rotation, it's sort of aligned to the world, right? Everything's still kind of left, right, up, down, and sort of neat. But if you switch this to object, you can now see the axis is oriented to the camera itself, right? So rotation in this case doesn't really matter, but you can pull the camera back, maybe slide it to one side, close the display. I'll set this back to perspective here. So one thing I like to do too, sometimes I like to have sort of two planes, either side by side or stacked. So yeah, let me switch this. So I can go into the panels. So you just have to go to the top of the label here, panels, perspective, and I'll switch to camera 1. So again, ideally when you're setting up your camera, you have to know a few things. The first thing is the resolution and the proportion of the image. For me, everything's going to be HD proportions, since that's what we're working with all the way until your final film. So I like to go to the settings option here at the top. That's render settings, because the camera will kind of look towards the render settings. Right now it's in HD 540, which is totally fine. Chances are when you give me renders though, I'm going to want them in 720 or 1080p. So you can always switch from the preset area here in the render settings to 720 or 1080. I'll choose 1080 for now and close that. So if I go into the settings here, again, looking at the top of the viewport, what I want to do is basically set what's called the resolution gate. There we go, resolution gate, and there's basically this kind of masking option. So what that does is it kind of obscures the area that's not going to be seen by the renderer. One other thing I generally like to do as well is go down to, where is it? Output setting, no. Yes, display options. There's this thing called overscan. So let me just make this a full viewport here so you can see that. So what's happening is, oops, switch actually out to camera 1. So what's happening is overscan is kind of like cropping your viewport and kind of giving you a safe zone, which I find in most cases is not exactly necessary. So I'm going to just go to my outliner, select my actual camera. So that's camera group and then camera. And so under here, under display options, all right, if you scroll down, you'll see overscan. I just set that to 1. Once you hit enter and set it to 1, you see that resolution kind of fills. So you go to the maximum. Whatever your viewport can handle, it'll kind of fit the viewport window frame, and it'll still show you the mask. So if you ever do like preview renders and stuff, it'll sort of cut this off. Okay, so let's go back. I'll go back to the viewport layout. I'll go 2 panes side by side, and I'll just switch this one over here to perspective. So I usually do this in the early phase. You know, I want to kind of grab the camera, maybe slide it back, change its angle, maybe change the point of view as well. So I might slide that over a bit. The other thing you want to do is select the focal length. Now, do you guys understand what focal length is? Yes? No? So in a traditional sense, you guys had a digital photography class, right? So what happens is you've got the lens, which is in millimeters. Typically, the lower the number of millimeters of the lens, it basically means there's a greater curvature in the lens. With the greater curvature comes a wider field of view, meaning that when you have a zoom lens of like 200 millimeters, okay, you're kind of like zooming right into the corner and things get kind of flat. If you have a wide angle lens, which is typically considered 35 or wider, so in a lot of your interior shots, you may have to go as low as potentially 20 millimeters. And if you look at the angle of view above, it's actually going to get larger, right? So as the focal length goes down, the view angle of view gets higher. So again, something to really consider, especially if you want to fit more into your view. So I'll do that. I'll slide this over, move this thing, the aim over, let's say. Now also keep in mind, if your camera is still sitting outside the building, to get the kind of view you want, so if I left the pointer over here, I may have to cheat the size and proportions of the building as well. So in that case, I would basically scale the building a little bit wider, just so it sort of encompasses that frame, that camera angle. Okay, so grab, let's say cylinder 1, cylinder 2. So I'm going to put both cylinders, I'm going to middle mouse click and drag them into the group. This is in the outliner, so they're now just basically part of one group. Something I learned too, actually, if you guys want, we'll go back to window and outliner. So there's a bit of a weird issue when you grab a group, okay? I'm going to call these columns for now. By the way, if you want to rename stuff, I'm a big fan of renaming and organizing scenes. So I'm going to select all of these. I'll go to modify, and I'm going to go to was it prefix or search and replace names. actually. Now you can do something like this where you go prefix, where you add a name in front. It just sort of slaps something in front of the naming of the objects, or you can go search and replace. So in this case, I want to go P cylinder, right? That sort of sucks as a name. So I'm going to go P cylinder, and I'm going to replace that with columns underscore. So I'm going to say this is for all selected, and I'm going to hit apply, and you're going to see on the left side in the outliner, this should change all the names, right? Boom, done, organized, clean, easy to read, right? You may wonder why put an underscore instead of a space. Well, you guys ever download a file from the internet that has all these weird characters in between words? That's what happens when you leave empty spaces. A lot of times in network transfers, whatever, computers fill empty spaces with a certain kind of coding. So it's always good to put underscores instead of sort of just an empty space, right, with your space bar. I guess as one final tip, I want to talk about replacing these things. So I mentioned that, you know, when you do your blocking, things are going to be very simple, low poly objects. Well, let me just make a copy. All right, so in the copy, I'm just going to do some really basic editing to get the point across. Oops. Yeah, I'll just do insert loop tool. Nothing too fancy here, right? Object mode. Let's go back to edge. Okay, so I'll just sort of chamfer these things. Oops. There we go. Go back to edge mode. So I'm just doing a ring select in this case where I'm grabbing the parallel edges. Yeah, let's see. Control right click and I'll say convert this to faces. There we go. And then shift right click and do an extrude on that and do an offset like so. Again, for your projects, you'll be doing something a little bit more elaborate probably. So what I'll do is I'll go back to the outliner, display, Windows, outliner. I'm just going to double click on the group. Actually, the column is in here, the extra column. So I'm going to find this, yeah, I'll move this last column sort of out on its own. So I'll double click the group. This is kind of important. The order is important. So grabbing the group, I'm going to shift click to add the final one, basically the new version of the column. And I'm going to go modify, replace objects. Of course, it gets all weird. Try again. Modify, replace objects. There we go. Yeah, it might be getting strange here. Let me try that one more time. So it might be strange because I'm going through the group, I guess, but let me go back to outliner. So I'll just go into the group itself. Yeah, I could. I'm going to just try this one more time, though. Modify, replace objects, and they're all replaced now with the new column. You guys see that? Yeah, you want to avoid grabbing the group. I think I just selected the group, and that's why it got a little weird to replace the whole group with the one column, and it put it where the pivot point was. So you want to go into the group, grab them all, and then replace them. So when you guys transition from blocked object, right, so your low poly cubes, cylinders, or very, very basic shapes that you have set up in your scene, and you want to replace stuff, that's kind of the simple way to do it. Grab all the copies that are being replaced with a higher poly version. Now you won't need to worry about that until assignment 2 for virtual worlds, but just to sort of show you guys how that would work. Also, sorry, go ahead.
Just after select the model, whatever the high poly that's going to be, and then select the other.
No, so Maya's got a particular way in which it works, right? So usually you select your last object. If the last object is the thing that's replacing the rest, that's the thing you select last. So what I would do is grab my low poly columns first, then hold shift and grab the new high poly or detailed object. Then I'd go modify, replace objects. And once that happens, they're all replaced and updated, right? So now I can just go delete the one column that I've imported to my scene. One other thing too, I mean, when it comes to groups, there's kind of this a few interesting options here. Under display, there's this thing called display handles. So what it does is it kind of creates a, I don't know if you guys can see that, it sort of adds a little kind of, a little, basically handle, right? A little icon that you can use to grab the group. So when you're grabbing stuff, you can grab the individual columns or grab the group just by grabbing that little handle. Okay, so that can be a very useful tool. And there's also this sort of hierarchy node option for selecting, which is very, very tiny right here at the top. By default, you've got, and I think I prefer working the default mode, which is basically that whatever you grab is what you grab. In this case, this is sort of a hierarchy mode where you basically, when you grab something, you're grabbing the whole top of the hierarchy. In this case, the top of the hierarchy is the group, right? So if you deselect the group and you grab any of the columns, it grabs the whole group at once. So if you're working with groups and you want to kind of make things a little quicker, you can decide which mode is better. For me, I personally like using the kind of default selection mode where I can just grab the individual items and move them, position them. Or if I turn on the handle option under display, right, for the group, then it's easy to grab the group as a whole and kind of move it around, right? Or I can still go in, like I said, and grab an individual column. Maybe I want to like rotate it, kind of throw it on the ground, break it, whatever. Maybe I'll flip that the other way, leaning against the wall or something. Right, so those are some things you can kind of look at playing with.